Welcome to this new episode of the Learn Buteyko podcast. Today we are going to make an interlude to our asthma series because Christopher Drake has been giving a series of interviews and we are going to reproduce them here for you in the context of the podcast because Christopher is going to lay it out for you, things that you might have already heard in the podcast, but he puts them very succinctly and very eloquently about the basics, the scientific grounds for the method, also its history, and he delves also into the subject in which we started last week, which is asthma. And I leave you with Christopher, and I hope you enjoy it.
Buteyko method. He never wanted it to be called Buteyko method. In fact, it was a huge fight between Professor Buteyko and Stalmatsky. And it was at my expense because I had to pay for the phone bill. Calling Australia to Russia back in those days, the Australian telecom charged you an absolute ridiculous amount of money. And these days, everyone makes international calls like it's no one's business. Back in those days, calling Russia from Australia was just prohibitively expensive. I won't go into detail on how I met Stalmatsky, but we had only just started to work with the idea of marketing and promoting and me putting in the money basically and helping him to train people to this method. And I was pretty convinced that he could do something quite good. But I didn't know really much the practical side. I wasn't that much interested in learning it myself, actually, but I wanted him to go with it. And now came the issue of what we're going to call it. And Stalmatsky had already had some bad experiences with people who were going to help him, but it didn't work out. And then I got involved with him, and he said that we should call it Buteyko method, and I was completely in agreement with that. But I wanted some documentation from Professor Buteyko that we had the rights to do this, because you don't want any comeback. And so Stalmatsky was discussing this with Professor Buteyko, and Professor Buteyko didn't want it to be called Buteyko method. He said it should be called his name, which was the acronym, Russian acronym DVBM, which stood for the volitional liquidation of deep breathing. The volitional liquidation of deep breathing. And I said, you must be crazy. That's never going to work. You're never going to market a thing like that. It's dreadful. And then he said, I have another name, the diamond method. I said, that's even worse. The diamond method, He said, well, diamond is carbon dioxide. I said, yeah, I know, but I mean, it's not going to fly. It's too ridiculous. And then Stalmatsky said, we want to call it Buteyko method. And Buteyko said, no, he wouldn't have it. And this great debate went on these long distance phone calls. It took about a week, or at least 3 or 4 days. And finally, Professor Buteyko relented and gave us permission to call it Buteyko method. And that's why it got its name. Buteyko method. Well, what is it? It's a very simple idea. The problem is to somehow make use of the... Professor Buteyko had an antagonistic high blood pressure, which is very nasty. And you don't live very long, quite often with this particular chronic condition. It tends to kill you off young. And he had it. And he hypothesized, he reckons that he noticed that when he was out of breath, the angina aspects of this, or he felt something worse. And then when he reduced his breath, he felt better. And then when he held his breath, he could stop symptoms and so forth. He didn't do it very seriously, just little things. And then that made him curious. And then somehow he got onto the work of Verigo. Verigo was a Russian physiologist who made the same discovery that Bohr made, B-O-H-R, the Bohr effect and all that. And Verigo had this idea about hemoglobin carrying oxygen and potential hydrogen, blah, blah, blah. And so that was a discovery that was Buteyko found very interesting. And then he came across the work of Henderson, L.J. Henderson, the American. And that really grounded him into the idea. And then he started to work on it and develop the method, the technique. And that took him some years, I think it was. And then to perfect the technique or develop the technique and to do all the theory and hypothesis and biochemistry and trials and all kinds of things was around 8 years or so before he would make it public. He was not about not making it public, but he wouldn't present it to the scientific community until he had it more or less all tied down. And so the technical backing of his method is very thorough and very consistent with the principles of physiology, biology, biochemistry, and all blah, blah, blah. And the funny thing was, he wasn't particularly interested in treating patients, sick people. He wanted this idea to be understood by the authorities and that it would go into schools and for pregnant women and so forth, because he felt that the coming generations will all be ruined because of this hyperventilation, chronic CHVS, chronic hyperventilation syndrome, which he said will destroy society. Of course, he would want sick people to be healed and so forth, but he felt the more important task was to have this incorporated into all prenatal thing, whatever's in the hospitals and pregnant women and small children and all this kind of stuff. This was the thing. And he had done other work in the medical science arena and was considered as an academician, like a serious gun, and recognized by the state as somebody of high value in terms of, and he did there were a lot of papers published in high altitude flying and all kinds of medical stuff that he authored with other people. And so he was considered to be quite serious in his field. And so because it's a Soviet system, you can't say he's well-to-do, but he was well looked after, put it that way, well looked after. And then he began his, of course, he had problems with the medical establishment. He became like a dissident within the medical world. And and he was sort of untouchable a bit because he had very good contacts with the Russian Air Force, military, and space program and all this kind of stuff. So they wouldn't mess with him too much because he was quite superior to a lot of the, what would you call them, more bureaucratic, managerial, medical world. And that's why he stayed in Academicity and Novosibirsk. You couldn't stay there if you weren't somebody of well, that's not true. There are regular people living there as well. But as an academic, you had to be pretty top drawer to be there. And he was well known for interfering in other laboratories and in other fields of science. He'd poke his nose in there and tell them what to do and so forth. So a lot of people were quite annoyed with him. But he actually was very successful in making good assessments, and he had a lot of respect. And his lectures were extremely well attended. His idea, basically, the depth of the breathing, for a whole range of reasons we aren't going to right now, meant that the organism was losing too much CO2, and CO2 was essential on many different levels, and that you had to restore the level of CO2. And the most efficient, effective way to do that was through his method of breath holding and breath control and relaxation and understanding how the organism functions and some other rules, bits and pieces. And he set out to demonstrate this with very severely ill patients. And he set out not really to create a protocol on how to treat very ill patients, but more to prove to the authorities that he was a very serious contender and that his ideas around how babies and pregnant women should be dealt with should be implemented and accepted throughout the country. That's what he thought should happen. Well, that's not going to happen because authorities don't work like that. And the more he became at odds with the medical authorities, the more there were this political stuff going on with his method, which was quite amusing in a way. Well, not really amusing, but a lot of interesting twists and turns. Eventually in the 80s, his approach was designated by the Ministry of Health as the official treatment for asthma and for various hormonal issues. And I'm not sure if it included angina, but it included asthma and these hormonal issues, certain hormonal problems. And that was authorized. I think the minister's name was Petrov, 84 or something. And that became the law. That's the law. His method is the way the government, and it's a communist country, so what they say kind of goes. But they're very clever because they're bureaucrats and there was no implementation. It can be like the law. Everyone gets $10,000, but there's no money. So it was the law. The Buteyko method is the official method for the treatment of those diseases, but no one was taught it. There was no arrangements made. There was no implementation. And so he realized he was not a very good politician. He's a very good scientist, super smart, incredible perceptions and scientific skill or whatever, but he was not a politician. In fact, he was a terrible politician. At one particular stage, through a lot of people helping him out, a lot of support, and finally he got to a meeting and there were members of the Politburo there. There were all kinds of important people. And Professor Buteyko said, they're all mad and sick from brain vessel sclerosis from deep breathing. That's why, that's their problem, you see. And of course, that didn't go down very well politically. All the mad deep breathers who've got brain vessel sclerosis. I think everybody must have gone, oh no, that's finished. You've just insulted the chairman of the Supreme Soviet or whatever, and that's the end of that deal. And at one time he was even poisoned. And I don't know, no one actually, I never found out who they blamed it on, but it was some political thing and they tried to murder him. He fasted for, I think it was 60 days or something. He looked terrible at the end of it, apparently. I saw photos of it, looked not very good, but he fully recovered. Yes, and so his idea was to change the breathing pattern so as to normalize, to accumulate and normalize the levels of CO2, and this would be the way to reverse disease. He never really ran workshops. That was something that Stalmatsky put together. Stalmatsky was his #1 protege, and Stalmatsky developed the idea of running workshops, and Buteyko, of course, had a system whereby these practitioners would go around following the protocol that Stalmatsky put together. And if they had problems or didn't know what to do, they would call up Buteyko and he would tell them. And so that's how they became skillful. And he didn't really allow someone to become a practitioner until they'd seen a few thousand patients and got lots of, like uniformly good results. And then on the proviso that his initial group of students sort of would have to approve, and then he would allow them to be. I think it took Vladimir, I don't think he got a red diploma on until 7 years or something. I got a red diploma after 5 or 6. You got to see quite a few people. You got to see quite a few patients. And it's funny because even the things that we disagreed with him on, he turned out to be right. Everything he said, because in Australia, the idea was that we would focus on asthma because you get very quick results with asthma. You can just make overnight or just in a couple of days. It was quite dangerous in those days. It's quite illegal, kind of, to be promoting to treat a disease like asthma. You go to jail, And so we didn't, because the patients got better. And then you got a few news articles, and then you're interviewed, and then there's some sort of like thing going on, and then somehow you're no longer in jeopardy. But in the beginning stages, we got our break, I guess. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with it, but I think the Americans will be, the Australians. I think you got the same thing in Ireland, the UK as well. But there's a program called A Current Affair, and that's, I think, a franchise of something from the US. Their format is to interview politicians, to expose fraudulent business people, all kinds of sort of journalistic stuff for the television meat market, if you will. And they came to our clinic, and I thought, well, they're going to do an expose on the Buteyko method, and it wasn't going to be positive. It was going to be obviously negative, because there'd been a lot of complaints, which were ginned up by the Asthma Foundation and these other people. And it was just by luck. It was just by luck that the guy who was they charge into the clinic with the cameras on their shoulders, and they shove a microphone in your face and say, "Are you a doctor?" And no, you can't really explain yourself, and then everything gets cut up and on the editing floor, and then you just turned into a complete crook, And it just so happened that one of the little workshop was being done there, and the presenter or the chief journalist who was doing this thing recognized someone in the group and said, "Don't you know that this is a fraud?" And the guy said, "No, it's not. I'm doing really well. My asthma is much better only after 3 days." And the guy's like, turned around to the cameras and said, "Stop. Wait. What? We've been told by Asthma Foundation and this professor from this hospital, these fraudulent crooks are stealing money from vulnerable asthmatics." And then Stalmatsky said, "Well, look, why don't you take all our patient forms and call all our students and find out for yourself," which is quite improper. You can't divulge that sort of information to a stranger. So anyway, we came to an arrangement so that they could come to the clinic, and then they could contact all of our patients, which they did. And then they realized that we weren't the frauds. The Asthma Foundation were the frauds. So they decided they just turned their guns on somebody else, And so it was supposed to be a story of this Russian crook and this other crook, local crook, peddling some ridiculous theory, which is not helpful and very expensive to vulnerable asthmatics, and it could be dangerous for them. That was going to be the story. And of course, we'd end up in jail or fined or something dreadful. And the reverse happened. It was a 3-part series. And that's how the method became known in Australia. And that's how I was fortunate to see thousands of students, and under the auspices of Alexander Stalmatsky. And the method is not really for asthma particularly. It's for any disease which has its genesis in chronic hyperventilation syndrome and this deepening of the breath. But we still stuck mainly to asthma. And we of course, naturally went towards things like emphysema, COPD, because they use asthma medications. So, people put 2 and 2 together. And then, of course, some of the patients, they had COPD or asthma, but they had other conditions as well. And then we can say, well, if you keep on practicing, we can show you how to lower your blood pressure or whatever. And so then the other diseases starting to became more pronounced. We always believed that the doctors are okay, actually. They're just conservative. And the drug companies, naturally, they're promoting their drugs. But the system, they're just conservative. That's all it is. And all we need to do is get medical trials. And everyone told us, and I guess it was because everyone told us so often, you need medical trials, medical trials, medical trials. So eventually we bit the bullet and we got involved in these medical trials. I spent $250,000 and the results were perfect. People say it was a small trial. Well, it only involved 20 or whatever people. It wasn't a huge trial. However, they were double-blind, randomized, controlled, which means you've got two groups, and the two groups have to be identical. So if you've got a couple of children in one group, you've got to have a couple of kids in the other group. If you've got a very severe asthmatic overweight in one group, you've got to have the similar one, the two groups. And so you've got to go through thousands of people that are going to be compliant and are going to follow instructions so that you've got this more or less identical groups. So it's considered a very serious kind of trial. And it bankrupted our business because there was the money that you got to put up. And then you didn't want to wreck the blindness of the trial so that the people wouldn't know who's learning who's learning the fake technique and who's learning the real technique and all this kind of stuff. So it made it very difficult. But anyway, we got the results and a few very interesting things happened. The results were so good that a very conservative medical journal called Australian Doctor, very conservative, very conservative, what can I say? And their headline on their front page, on their cover, was "Doctors Gasp at Buteyko's Success." So basically, just about everyone in the trial came off all their medication and were symptom-free or greatly reduced within 4 or 5 days. Some people needed further coaching to wrap it up, but the results were absolutely unheard of, this scale of results. And so the journals were very honest about it and wrote it all up. And I thought, that's it. We will get work. The universities will want to research it. Hospitals will want to have it taught in their asthma clinics and so forth. And insurance companies will be interested. And doctors will be interested. You know, it's in the journal. It's in the journal. You know, they're going to be keen. They'll want to do it. And nothing. Not a single insurance company. Not a single university. It's like a conspiracy of silence. And asthma is very serious in New Zealand and in Australia. There's serious diseases. And it was unbelievable. What got us results was getting on the publicity from the current affair, 3-part series. They dramatized it too, a lot of drama. You know, they got some little girl with asthma in Melbourne and they airlifted her to Sydney by helicopter. Will Leanne make it? You know, and the doctors say, no, it's too severe. She can't do everything we can. All this kind of drama. Anyway, and that produced thousands of patients. That produced the patients, but not. And Buteyko said right from the beginning, you'll get nothing from the trial, nothing. If they haven't indicated interest based on the physiology, the biology, the testimonials, and the seriousness of our literature, the trial won't make any difference. And I said, no, this is Australia. We're good people. We're not like Russians. They're crooks. Australia. when you got the trials, when you got the documentation, they will definitely be interested on a serious level. Well, it was like a conspiracy. And the really weird, the weirdest thing that happened was it appeared in quite a few medical journals, the writing up of the trial and so forth. I remember on the day after or whatever, I'm not sure where I was. I could have been driving my car. You haven't got them anymore, but do you remember those things when the headlines of the newspapers used to be put in like a cage, and they would hang them outside the news agency with the headlines, just to tell you what the headlines were? And it was asthma breakthrough. Herald Sun, asthma breakthrough. And I thought, that must be us. That's us. That's us, because we just did the trials to show that if you do this method, you can come off all your medication and be symptom-free, because that's what the trials showed, to a degree of like 80% or better. And I rushed into the news agency, get that Herald Sun or whatever it was, Newsweek or whatever. And it wasn't about us. It was about the real cause of asthma. Margarine. Margarine. That's all you got to do. Stop eating margarine. All these, and this full articles, and this, it's like they bulldozed a ton of shit, and it was everywhere. Woman's Weekly, Woman's Day, Sydney Morning Herald, Newsweek, all the newspapers were full of it, and all the news reports on television were talking about margarine. You got to go to butter, not margarine. Margarine causes asthma. And we were completely drowned out in the media by an anti-margarine crusade. Couldn't believe it. And of course, margarine it's got nothing to do with it. As far as we're concerned, I never heard Buteyko say, margarine probably is no good for you. I don't know even what margarine is. But anyway, that was what happened. So Buteyko was, I still have my doubts about calling it the volitional liquidation of deep breathing, but now that time might be changing when that name may make more sense. But it wouldn't surprise me if it's probably a better name than calling it Buteyko method, because he initially didn't approve of it, and it was Stelmatsky who twisted his arm. That was, it started off in about 89 or 1990 or something around that area. So it's been going a few years.
I was wondering, Chris, if you'd say, what does CO2 do for asthma, mechanically speaking?
It dilates the bronchivessels. Asthma is a disease, which is not really a disease in the sense that what people think of, the way they think about diseases. It's not something wrong with a person. It's their defensive mechanism. They breathe too deeply. They breathe too much. And the body responds, trying to prevent this by constricting the vessels. And there's many vessels, bronchivessels and blood vessels and heart vessels, and this vagus nerve system and all this. It's not as simple as I'm saying, but what I'm saying is basically correct. That the vessels spasm, which is an asthma, and that's what an asthma is, spasming of vessels in response to a low level of CO2, and it's a defensive mechanism. And it's the second primary defense mechanism, the first one being a blocked nose, the second one being bronchivessels, which constrict. And interestingly, I'm not saying that there were no deaths from asthma before the advent of bronchodilating medication, but what I am saying is there's no recorded deaths. There's no deaths in the literature, in medical literature, no discussion points or articles about cause of death being asthma until the introduction of bronchodilating medications. Because the bronchodilator does the reverse. The bronchodilator opens up the vessels, which makes the symptoms go away. And in so doing, permits the continued loss of CO2, which the body was trying to prevent. So you fight against the defensive mechanism, and it works. I mean, you can take some local anesthetic and inject it into your hand, and you won't feel your hand being burnt as you put it into a fire. That's not a cure for being burnt. That's just disconnecting the reaction to the nervous system. And likewise, these bronchodilators, they bring people some relief, of course, but they actually make the problem worse. And the stronger the medications, the worse the asthma becomes. And the more they treat it, the more it gets worse. That's the peculiar reality. And this method was very quick and efficient and all very well grounded in physiology and biology and so forth. But the establishment, I don't know if I can blame anybody. I don't know. I can have my theories and so forth, but this was unacceptable, just unacceptable at its core somehow. And I remember one time we were at a hospital, St. Alfred's in North Sydney, I think it was. This is after the media thing in the current affair and all this hullabaloo. And so someone somehow got us to give a talk to a group of doctors and nurses at the hospital. And this is quite a casual thing. And Stalmatsky's talking, and his English is not so great, but still he's explaining. And one of the doctors there said, I just can't believe it. He had some rationalization why he was not agreeing. And Stalmatsky said, look, have you got any children here with a blocked nose? But permanently blocked nose, always blocked. And we kept on talking, and some of them went out there to look for some kid or something. And they came back with a small child, the kid, a boy about, I don't know, he looked about 10 or 9 or 10 or something, 11 or whatever. And he had never had a clear, his nose was always blocked, permanently blocked. And Stalmatsky said, look, any treatment you can give for him. And they all agreed there was nothing that worked. They'd everything been tried and nose is blocked. There's one, they do a surgery where they destroy all the turbinates in the nose, and that apparently works. But there's no treatment, no medicine, nothing which works. And so I took over for a while, and Stalmatsky took this boy behind the area there and taught him squats and breath holding. And it took a while. They had to go at it for a while. But in about 10, 15 minutes of starting and stopping and trying again, eventually the kid comes around and said, my nose is clear. I can breathe through my nose. Never been able to breathe through my nose before. Both not, everything is open. I'm fine. And half the doctors began to squirm. Look at the watch. It's great, very good. Yeah, I got to go now. And then some chitting and chit-chatting and talking, and nobody was interested to discuss any more about it. And conversations sort of went like this and like that. It was very odd, very, very odd. There was this demonstration in their faces. Look, you can't do anything with this blocked nose situation. Within a few minutes, he's breathing through his nose. And they just dissolved somehow. And we're left with a few, and then a couple of doctors say, yeah, diet is also very important. Diet is these people, you've just seen in front of your eyes. And the same thing happens all the time. They have been taught to be superior, and that's it. It's effortless superiority. And that was it. They can't believe their eyes. So obviously they can't believe your words. On that note, I'll open up if anyone's got any questions. about Buteyko method generally, I'll try to answer them.
So there you have it. Remember, you can find us at www.learnbuteykoonline.net, and you can have free introductions to the method in English, of course, but also in other languages like Hebrew, Spanish, and Greek. You could also do it in Italian, perhaps German as well, even we're considering that. And I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you in the next one.